Welcome back. I'm Michelle McCory, and we are continuing our conversation with Cory Klippsten, CEO of Swan Bitcoin. And our focus now is on Argentina, which has just elected libertarian Javier Milei as its next president. The self-described anarcho-capitalist campaigned on closing Argentina's central bank, replacing the nation's currency, the peso, with the US dollar, and slashing spending and cutting taxes. And he's also quite supportive of Bitcoin, calling it the return of money to its original creator, the private sector. Now, Milei did not mention Bitcoin as part of his official campaign, but he did make his position very clear during one of many interviews given to the local media. And Milei called central banks a scam and described Bitcoin as a natural reaction to that scam.
Let's see, what is the point? The point is that the first thing we have to understand is that the central bank is a scam. It is a mechanism by which politicians cheat the good people with the inflation tax. What Bitcoin represents is the return of money to its original creator, the private sector. Money is a private invention. Bitcoin has an algorithm that one day it'll reach a certain amount and there is no more. Bitcoin is a natural reaction to central bank scamming and making money private again.
So can Milei actually make good on his promises to use the dollar as the country's official currency and kill Argentina's central bank? And could he at some point even follow the path of El Salvador, which was the first country to make Bitcoin legal tender in 2021? And what could all of this mean for Bitcoin and its adoption? Well, here to answer that is Cory Klippsten, CEO of Swan Bitcoin. So, Cory, we have the leader of the 8th largest country in the world, the second biggest economy in South America, saying central banks are a scam and that Bitcoin is the reaction to that scam. What do you make of his comments?
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to see someone elected to one of the, top 20 countries in the world to lead it. This is a momentous occasion. This is a much bigger deal on the global stage than what happened in El Salvador, although El Salvador has gone a lot deeper and is special in its own way. This really launches this idea of central banking being a scam, as Milei said. But at least being unfair and at least being maybe not all that people previously understood it to be. Not your viewers, of course, but a lot of folks around the world don't understand what is going on with the money printing and the Cantillon effect and that it's the cause of inflation and credit burst cycles and things like that. So I think it's fascinating to have someone that is this fluent in Austrian economics and in libertarian principles and really understands the root of much of what's wrong in the global system today, and in particular in local systems with crappy local fiat currencies kind of used as tools of tyranny and profligacy and just cronyism. And he wants to uproot that in his own country. And I think it may end up being quite the example for a lot of other countries around the world.
Right. I mean, it is very fascinating to start to see people wake up to the idea that central banking is, in fact, a scam. And he is an economist. Fun fact, one of his dogs is actually called Milton Friedman, which I thought was very amusing. Somehow I retained that little useless bit of information about Argentina's new president there. But one of the big reasons that he won this election, Cory, is because of Argentina's economy. It's such a disaster. And as the expression goes, it's the economy stupid. And Argentina is currently undergoing its 5th hyperinflation since 1975. Inflation currently running at 143% per year. And this was one of the richest countries in the world at some point. I mean, at some point, the peso was actually backed by gold. Clearly went off that back in 1929, and that's seen the economy fall apart. Certainly that accelerated that process. And he has said that he's very committed to the reconstruction of Argentina. In his victory speech, he said, "Today begins the end of Argentina's decline and the model of decadence has come to an end." And of course, saying that you want to cut spending and cutting about 11 government departments is a huge thing for a politician to say. We'll see if he'll be able to follow through on that. But he has reiterated his position that he wants to shut down Argentina's central bank. Very recently, he said that that is non-negotiable. And this came after reports that this promise would be dropped because of the exit of a number of key advisors from his transition team. And we know that politicians like to make a lot of promises and then not necessarily follow through. Before we get onto the Bitcoin side, I mean, is it even possible for him to kill the central bank? Can you have no central bank? What would that even look like for Argentina?
Yeah, so I admittedly am very unclear on whether the peso can continue in any fashion with the central bank being dead. What I have done some digging into is, and just talking to folks in my network, including some that are pretty well placed down there, is just to understand what would happen if they did try to dollarize. And what seems to be what everyone kind of is consensus on is that if you dollarized, you would see a dramatic, even faster fall in the value of the peso. So you would see something like a very quick 4 or 5x essentially of the dollar's value versus the peso. And so there's a bit of brinksmanship and maybe a bit of a race potentially to try to let that run before it can be blamed on him. And there may also be, right after he takes power and starts to do a few things, there may be a large incentive from his opposition to try to pin it on him and make it look as if the speculators are attacking the peso and they're doing it because of the election of Milei. But regardless, what you have is a lot of pressure against dollarizing because you have so much short-term credit that needs to roll over. And this is businesses, large and small, and also families and people that have credit, short-term loans that they've taken out that they need to roll over. And it's going to be a lot of pressure on them. If you dollarize, a lot of people would just be, in dire straits. That short-term pain, probably something on the order of kind of what happened for the first few years post-Brexit, maybe even more exaggerated than that versus what happened in the UK.
Right. Well, I mean, he has said that he wants to kill Argentina's central bank, move, which will be the end of the peso, as you just discussed, and move to the dollar. I mean, his intention is to move to the dollar. And Argentina has, I believe, like the second largest number of dollars in circulation than any other country. And in terms of actual like physical dollar notes that people have and are keeping, in boxes in their cupboards or under their beds, that they're hodling dollars as a store of value. But the question is, if you do go to the US dollar, you're kind of substituting one central bank with another, because then you're subject to the whims of the US central bank, to the Fed. So how does that work?
Yeah, you're just basically saying, hey, this is less bad, essentially. But, you're still going to have the melting ice cube of the dollar losing value, and you're subject to the whims of the Fed and the Treasury and all of their policies, and not even being able to have any influence on that because it's half a world away and they don't care about you, right? So that is kind of the issue with dollarizing. But it's definitely a steadier platform than you're on with a local tyranny-led crappy fiat currency in a smaller market. And it also is a half step toward Bitcoin, which is, I think, where a lot of these countries will end up as the century advances. The next 2-3 decades, I think you'll see a lot of countries full on Bitcoinized. And so, yeah, I think you're more likely, if you're already considering a different currency other than the one that won't have to.
Right. So if you're already giving up, in a way, control over your currency by moving it to the dollar where you're not going to have control, it's probably, as you quite rightly say, a step closer to moving to Bitcoin. And isn't that what we saw in El Salvador? Because El Salvador had the US dollar as legal tender and was being used widely in that country, which in a way paved the path for moving over to Bitcoin as legal tender. So you kind of see that as a first step in the path towards making Bitcoin as legal tender, going on to the US dollar and relinquishing the power of a central bank, of your own central bank.
The primary motivation of the current ruling class in any of these countries is to maintain power of the printing press. And so if they've given that up, then at that point, they would be relatively indifferent as to what that other currency is, as long as it, serves the needs of the country. It's no longer serving the needs of them and their friends, their cronies, because they can't print it out of thin air, whether it's the dollar or Bitcoin.
So how feasible is it if the scenario plays out and he does move to the dollar and does abolish the Argentinian central bank, and somehow the population still keeps him in power and he isn't overthrown by unhappy people in the streets? I mean, you could argue that they couldn't get any more unhappy than they are at the moment, or they're willing to suffer the short-term pain for long-term gain. How likely do you think it is that Argentina becomes next on the list to make Bitcoin legal tender?
It's a good question. I think there will be a lot of people talking about it and trying to educate all levels of the government down in Argentina. I know a lot of people have plans to go down, and a lot of people have been there already and have met with different people near Milei. I'm sure some people have actually met with him as well. I'm not privy to any of those conversations myself, but it's certainly on my radar, just as someone who runs a large Bitcoin financial services firm in the USA and has plans to go international with the Swan app in Brazil in 2024. We jumped Argentina right up into the top 3 or 4, maybe even right after Brazil or at the same time as Brazil, because of this news of Milei winning. So I think it's making a lot of people look at that country as one that you would want to go and try to turn on to Bitcoin, just like so many people have gone to El Salvador and opened offices and tried out new services on and around Bitcoin because of the friendly welcome that country has given.
And I will point out, Cory, that Argentina is the second largest economy in South America. Its economy may be faltering, but it's still the second largest economy in the South American continent. So right after Brazil, so certainly, a big formidable force in the Southern Hemisphere. Before we get into Swan's ambitions for the Southern Hemisphere, Brazil and Argentina, I want to get your thoughts on what could be an interesting development with regards to Argentina and the BRICS, because Argentina was one of the 6 countries invited to join the BRICS. Of course, Brazil, Russia, India, and China and South Africa. And that invitation was issued at the BRICS summit held in South Africa in August. Argentina, along with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, been extended an invitation. But it seems as though Argentina could turn this down. Last week, we heard from an economist who's believed to become the new foreign minister under Milei's administration, Diana Mondino. And she was quoted as saying that Argentina would not be joining the BRICS groups. That's according to several news agencies. She said she didn't understand how this would benefit Argentina if it were to join the BRICS. And Milei has been very vocally critical of China and the BRICS group in the past as well. So putting on your macroeconomic geopolitical hat here and taking off your Shipcoin PI t-shirt for a minute, how do you see Argentina's decision not to join the BRICS impact its global standing and what it could mean for the potential future of the BRICS?
I think this is just somebody willing to call a spade and just recognizing that being a member of the BRICS doesn't mean anything. And so what's the point? It would just be a way for more diplomats to have T&E expenses to go to fancy dinners in different places around the world and not accomplish anything. And he's just kind of like, let's forget that charade and not do that. When the BRICS, first of all, the concept of the BRICS in the first place is just a creation of Wall Street to try to sell emerging market bonds, right? It's just to try to finance debt for these countries and have a reason to bunch them together and have a different way to talk about developing countries or emerging markets. Emerging markets was another, developing countries and emerging markets were both terms created by Wall Street, and BRICS is a new one. But once you let in enemies, like mortal enemies, the way that this last round did and bring them in together, you basically neutered any potential decision-making capabilities that you might have ever had in the future as an organization. Because basically, let's say Iran and Saudi Arabia are on the list, right? Like if you have unanimous decision-making on anything, they will not vote together if it's bad for one of them, obviously. And then if you have to give up your autonomy and you're bound by the decision authority of some other method of consensus, whether it's majority or some kind of inner council made up of just Russia and China or something like that, then the small countries wouldn't stay in. They would leave if it was bad for them. And so they've made it big and included people that have no business being part of the same organization in terms of like economic cooperation. And so it already was basically made up, and now it's just completely neutered. And I think all you're seeing is that there's somebody willing to call bullshit on it.
All right, that's certainly a very interesting perspective, saying that you don't see the BRICS as having much influence. And you're quite right. Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill, he coined the term BRICS, and then they kind of ran with it. You know, he coined it for the emerging markets, and perhaps, as you quite rightly say, for there to be attention to this new asset class and a way to group it together. But then they kind of went with it, expanded, and seemed to have this big trend of wanting to push to move away from the dollar and this big de-dollarization agenda. And clearly that is exactly the opposite of what Milei seems to be going for. As we just discussed, he wants to move to the dollar. But if we fast forward a little bit, the big idea is for the BRICS to have some own common currency, you know, backed by a basket of commodities, potentially with gold being in there. Now, you could see a counter to that with a new common currency backed by Bitcoin. How does this play into the narrative of Bitcoin potentially becoming some form of backing to fiat currencies, or becoming the new standard, the Bitcoin standard? Does this development with Argentina and Argentina pulling out of the BRICS and perhaps going in another direction make that a more likely scenario in your mind?
So thinking about some kind of commodity-backed currency, you're still subject to all the political machinations and whims and just arguing and bickering over what would be in the basket. And to think that countries as diverse as the ones that are now making up the expanded BRICS, let alone even if it was just BRIC, it would never work with Brazil, Russia, India, and China, even though they've been around for decades talking about this and, you know, never made any headway there. Now it just gets even harder. And so to think that they would ever agree on some kind of new currency that they would all use in some way and come up with a basket of commodities to back that, I think is just fantasy. It just would never happen. And as far as Bitcoin, Bitcoin doesn't need to back anything. It is the currency. And so I think what you'll see over the coming decades is you'll see that these countries will adopt Bitcoin as a medium of exchange and a store of value, and they will actually conduct trade using Bitcoin for payment. This is something that's going to take a long time to play out, and the monetary capacity of the Bitcoin network is still vanishingly small, 750 billion or something like that. And I think we'll see 20 trillion by the end of the decade, and a lot more as the century rolls on. And then it will be the currency that most of these countries that otherwise can't agree on how to define their currency, how to create their currency, how to back their currency. It takes that out of the realm of politics and just lets them focus on being productive and lets them focus on peaceful trade, which is the entire point of Bitcoin in the first place.
Right. I mean, and you could say, again, when you have more and more world leaders talking about Bitcoin, pointing to it as a potential solution here, and the second largest economy in South America actively discussing this, I mean, it could take us a step closer to that game theory that we've discussed, that the minute a certain amount of central banks start buying Bitcoin, the FOMO kicks in, which is a theory that we've had many people on the show discuss. As you get us to a certain tipping point where all it takes is a critical mass of countries to start adopting Bitcoin or openly declaring that it is on their balance sheets, that then the others are too afraid to be left out of the game, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be something that we actually do see play out. I think that is the inevitable way that this works, that game theoretically. And again, Bitcoin is for enemies. So it's that one thing that we can all agree on, just like we all agreed on gold for millennia. And then gold just fell behind the speed of transactions over telecommunications networks. And that's kind of what happened starting in 1861. This is all laid out in Len Alden's new book, Broken Money, which you probably talked to her about it. But again, just the cliff notes on that. I love that framework for looking at what Bitcoin solves. And it's basically just that, since the invention of the telegraph, prior to that, we had transaction and settlement happening at the same time historically, and you could hand over the pieces of 8 or whatever for the transaction. Once you could come to terms on a deal and not be in the same place, now settlement couldn't happen at the exact same time. And essentially we had, how many years is that? I guess 147 years where transaction and settlement were not able to happen at the same time around the world. And Bitcoin in the white paper in 2008, and then the network operating in 2009. And now we're now being able to bring transaction and settlement to happen together again. And this is so funny because it's also kind of what underpins Safety and Amos's book, The Fiat Standard, which makes the case that actually, fiat in some ways, even though he's obviously a longtime gold bug, but he understands why fiat rose as a technology, and these digital dollars being whipped around and euro dollars and all the things that we complain about with 6102 Act and 1971 coming off the gold standard. But all of that was just, yes, there have been evil humans, but a lot of people were just trying to do the next best thing, to quote, I believe, a Frozen movie. They're literally just trying to do the next best thing. And you would still end up in the same place, even if they weren't being nefarious, because they were trying to solve that problem of not being able to transact and settle at the same time in the same place anymore. And now we have a way to do that. We have a way to transact and settle. We can transact over the internet or over the phone, and we can settle with Bitcoin at the same time. And so there's no reason for fiat anymore.
Well, let it go. Let fiat go. Bringing it back to the Frozen quotes, right? Just let it go. Let's talk about something that you've discussed. We talked about Lynn Alden and her writings, but you have been quite vocal on considering Bitcoin as the 6th technological revolution. And you see Bitcoin as, again, the 6th technological revolution after the Industrial Revolution, number 2 being steam, rail and steel, electricity and heavy engineering, oil, autos and mass production, the 5th revolution, information and telecommunications. And you state that a technological revolution like Bitcoin disrupts all of these industries, not just one or a few, and that these cycles take 50 to 60 years historically, not just 1 or 2 decades. So where are we then? Clearly in the very early stages of the Bitcoin tech revolution. Elaborate on that for us. How do you see this playing out for Bitcoin and the disruption of these other technologies and therefore its adoption?
Yeah, so these technological revolutions build on each other. So it's actually disrupting industries, not the previous technologies. But yeah, the first 4 great technological revolutions were all energy revolutions. And then we had an information revolution starting with the first Intel chip rolling off of a semiconductor fab line in 1971, ironically. And now you have Bitcoin as what I see as the 6th great technological revolution. And yeah, as you noted, in the framework of Carlotta Perez, who wrote the book, Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital, which is where I got the idea, I see she notes that these have taken historically 50 to 80 years, which means that you're not going to see the Bitcoin revolution mature until between 2060 and 2090. That's when it will really have played out and have spread through all the places that it's going to spread through. And we are just very much in the early stages here in year 15. It's still that flat part of the S curve before you start your way up. And this makes sense. I went and we grabbed a booth through a friend and brought Swan to the Abbott Kinney Street Fair in Venice Beach, California over the summer. And I had conversations with normal people walking by, and I was holding a sign saying, get some free Bitcoin or something like that. And over half the people that I talked to didn't know that you could buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. And of those people, half of them, just thought that I was trying to sell them a Bitcoin for $21 because we were saying we gave them $21 of free Bitcoin. So it was just kind of, it was amazing when you really mix it up with people. You know, I think in the macro world, in the gold world, in sound money circles, when you're talking to libertarians, you're talking to people that are interested in investing, it seems like Bitcoin is a lot more ubiquitous than it actually is. But almost nobody out there really understands what this thing is. It's just too complicated. It's just too wrapped up in all of the crypto noise from the last 6 years. And we haven't seen what it's like for the top of funnel about Bitcoin to be true instead of false. And I think we're going to wake up to how fast this thing can move when the information being put out about Bitcoin is true, that draws them in and not false.
And, so as we discussed in the first part of this interview, we're kind of moving towards that direction with some of the crypto exchanges falling to the wayside. So given that your thoughts on Bitcoin as a sixth technological revolution, where do you see Bitcoin in 50 years' time?
In 50 years' time, I think actually probably sooner than that, hopefully. You know, it will be the dominant global store of value. So, you know, in today's terms, it'll be something like, you know, if the global asset pie for store of value is somewhere between 400 and 900 trillion dollars, it's a pretty wide range depending on what you include in that pie. You know, I think Bitcoin is the best tool for the job, and it'll suck away a lot of the monetary premium that exists in real estate, in art, in obviously the other currencies that are out there. A lot of stocks and bonds are essentially used as savings, and people would rather not be their own personal hedge fund manager if they could have something that performs the same function that gold did historically. And now we have Bitcoin. And as it grows less volatile, people will just assume that it'll hold its value pretty darn well. And just like an ounce of gold always bought you a suit on Savile Row, it'll be some little bit of Bitcoin that will always buy you the same basket of goods or a little bit more over the decades and over the centuries. And that's how people will think about it once it's mature and kind of reached its natural level, and serving its rightful place for us 8 billion humans. And then on medium of exchange, when you have everybody on one currency, either denominating their wealth entirely in Bitcoin or at least holding a good chunk of it, maybe the dollar will still be around for another century or so. Maybe you'll still have a few other strong currencies like a yen, maybe the euro, probably not the euro, but the yen and the franc will probably make it for the rest of the century. But at least you'll have prices and services and goods, you know, products and services will be available in Bitcoin and in the local currency. And so you'll be able to transact for all goods and services around the globe in 50 years, denominated in Bitcoin prices. And then a lot of people will be using it obviously by then as their unit of account. So they'll denominate their wealth and the price of pretty much everything they think about in Satoshis, the smallest unit of Bitcoin, 100 million Satoshis or sats per Bitcoin.
All right. And as we discussed before, it needs to be established as a store of value before it really takes on its role as a medium of exchange, as a unit of currency. And in terms of establishing the role of store of value, that's where institutional investment becomes so important. And to that end, Swan Bitcoin is introducing a new division, Swan Institutional. So tell us about that as we wrap up here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we obviously have recognized this trend of large companies wanting to get in the game, and they're approaching it through ETFs, but they're also looking at it for their treasuries, different companies. And then there's a lot of large players in the Bitcoin space that just need different services. So yeah, we've quietly launched Swan Institutional and been building it up over the course of this year. It's a big unit for us already. It's already doing north of $100 million of revenue annually right now. And we have things like Swan Lending, which is asset-backed loans. So you pledge Bitcoin and take out a 50% dollar loan. Makes it so that you don't have to incur capital gains tax by selling Bitcoin, or if you just want to ride your Bitcoin long and would rather pay a low interest rate on the dollar loan, you can do that. We have institutional custody. We have asset management. So we've launched Swan Ventures and are making venture investments in the space. And we also have a couple of active strategies that we have one fully subscribed, another one coming out in a couple of months. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more about what's available, whether you're a corporation that wants to go the MicroStrategy route, or if you're a country that wants to go the El Salvador route, or you're a Bitcoin company like maybe a public miner or something like that, and you're looking for what we've got, get in touch. Happy to talk to you.
All right, so we've got Swan Institutional, and as we touched on, Swan also expanding into Brazil and into Argentina. So pretty big 2024 ahead for Swan.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting time. You know, I always wondered if we could find a way to grow before a bull market, or if we would just be kind of buffeted about by the whims of the market. And so it's been pretty amazing to see us grow something like 15, 16x year over year, 23 over 22. And that's before the bull market really takes off. So I think we're in a really good position. We're hiring like crazy and preparing for big things. A lot of expansion coming up.
Now, you did raise around $195 million in equity in 2023 and credit funding, and you currently generate $125 million in annualized revenue. Can you give us any kind of estimates for next year in terms of Swan annualized revenue that you're expecting?
Yeah, we have pretty good visibility on how things are growing across financial services and across the institutional units. And, you know, I feel pretty comfortable believing that we'll cross 200 million annualized revenue in the first half 2024, maybe as early as Q1. So that's kind of about the path that we're on.
Is that subject to the price of Bitcoin staying above a certain level?
No, it's not at all. That's just kind of what's happening. I would say that things would be impacted by a dramatic crash of some sort. But as far as, you know, if there's a drawdown to 25K again or something like that, I don't think that would really affect us that much.
So is 25K sort of your I guess, bottom, your support line?
It would change strategies for us. I mean, I personally, I mostly think about it like what would be depressing to me. It would be depressing to me if we went back below 25K, but I don't care much if we see another 2 handle and see 28, 29 or something like that again. You know, I think we're on the march up, but there are always pullbacks on the way.
All right. And as we've discussed, a lot of factors that can help propel Bitcoin to higher highs in 2024. And I know I asked you this in the first part of this interview, and I urge our viewers to check it out. But in terms of a price forecast that you're happy leaving us with, do you have a date where you can say you're pretty comfortable in saying you think Bitcoin reaches and exceeds its all-time high by?
Oh, that's fair. Yeah. So when are we going to hit?
When are we going to hit above 69,000?
I think we'll blow through 70K, no problem, by 2025.
Getting a 2025, end of 2025.
I'm not going to say something that specific.
Okay, all right. I'll say mid 2025. Give you some leeway there. All right, over 70K. Well, towards the last quarter of 2025.
Michelle, you don't want to know what I really think, because I don't give price prognostications in public other than my 2030 target. But I'm bullish.
We know you're very bullish, and we know your 2030 target is $1 million per Bitcoin, correct?
That's right. And by the way, that's in 2020 dollars, not nominal US dollars. So all right. It'll be more like 1.5 or 1.6 by then.
That's okay. No, that's definitely an important point to highlight. All right. So 2030, $1 million Bitcoin in today's dollar term, and by 2025, certainly hitting a new all-time high of 70,000. I will take this opportunity, Cory, to thank you for sponsoring some of the Kitco content and to tell our viewers that Swan has been a partner with Kitco on a number of our shows. We're very appreciative towards that. And again, we always do vet our sponsors very carefully, which is why I like to grill you and put you on the spot as often as I do. So thank you for sharing your insights with me in part 1 and part 2 of this interview. And we'll look forward to chatting to you again soon.
Really my pleasure. And to be very clear, it has ended up being an incredible partnership, but the real reason we did that is because we wanted you to come to the conference and interview some of us. So we thank you and the whole team, and your crew is fantastic. So thank you so much for the partnership.
Well, thank you. We were there and we certainly enjoyed Pacific Bitcoin, a lot of fantastic content and tremendous energy. And we look forward to being there again next year. So Cory, on that note, thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll chat with you again soon. Thank you. And as always, thank you for watching. From me, Michelle McCory, and the rest of the Kitco News team. We'll see you again soon. Keep it right here.